Hello, my name is Theresa Graham-Mineart and I'm with the Abbe Center for Community Mental Health. For the next 50 minutes or so, we're going to talk about trauma. The events at the Anamosa Penitentiary in the last few weeks have rocked the community, and we know that you're hurting and we want to be helpful. I'm a mental health counselor. I'm a certified alcohol and drug counselor, and I've been with the Abbe Mental Health Center for 24 years. And in that time, I've heard a lot from other people about their experiences with trauma. But I also had the privilege of studying with Dr. Robert Macy. He's a nationally recognized trauma expert. And the East Central region, which is funded by your tax dollars, provided opportunity for many providers in the East Central region to get training to understand trauma better so that in the event of primary or secondary trauma, we can be helpful to individuals, families, and communities. For the next 50 minutes or so, again, we are going to be talking about trauma. I want you to know, though, that there are not going to be graphic pictures. There will be not any graphic depictions. This is a conversation around what trauma is, how it affects your brain, how it affects our bodies and psychology, how we can cope as individuals, and how we can come together as communities to be more resilient than we were before. Sometimes thinking about talking about trauma can be anxiety producing. And so at this time, I'd like you to take a breath and just relax. Today is a little bit of science, a lot of reassurance, and practical tips to help you move forward. A quote that I really like is by Dr. Rachel Remen, and it has to do with trauma, secondary trauma in particular. She says, "The expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet." Trauma affects all of us, both the people that are close to it in proximity, either were involved in the altercation or the attack directly or witnessed it. But the rest of us at homes and our workplaces were affected as well. If you think about a still pond and you take a rock and you throw it into that pond, there's a splash when it hits the surface. And the fish and the plants, they're affected by the rock as it sinks. And so that can be the primary trauma. But when we think about the ripples on the surface that can go all the way to the water's edge, that's often what we talk about when it's secondary trauma. We're all affected by trauma and we can all heal. What is trauma? Trauma is a response to something. It's an event or a series of events that are distressing. They typically invoke intense fear, and they're often overwhelming. There are many examples of trauma: car accidents, natural disasters, and of course the attack recently at the Anamosa Penitentiary. Sometimes trauma affects just a couple of people. Maybe at least initially it looks that way, but often trauma has that ripple effect again, like the pond. Primary trauma is often used to describe the people that are intimately involved with the traumatic event. These can be victims, these can be perpetrators, these can be people who witnessed the event or are there immediately after the event. Secondary trauma are the rest of us, what we tend to think of as bystanders, people who are related to those who have primary exposure, people who watch the news, people who have loved ones that go in and out of places where traumatic events have occurred. In the case of the attack at the penitentiary, secondary trauma could be anybody that is related to someone who works there, maybe a contractor that goes into the penitentiary, family members or friends of those incarcerated, and the community, those of us seeing it on the news, those of us grappling with how something could happen to us here in Eastern Iowa. Primary and secondary trauma are both real. It's important to consider who decides what is traumatic. It's the person that experiences it. So for example, if I and my friend Leslie are in a situation and we both experience a trauma, or our partners maybe experience a similar trauma, just because something ends up having more of an effect on me than it does my friend Leslie doesn't mean that there's something stronger about Leslie or weaker about me. The degree to which someone is impacted or has a traumatic response has many complexities. Neither of us is wrong or stronger. It is what it is. Rather, it's important to keep in mind that traumatic responses are not decisions or choices. In fact, they are biology. It is wired into our brain. We remember trauma less in our words and more with our feelings and our bodies. This is your brain. And our brains develop from the stem to the middle to the frontal and outer. Our brain stem is our reptilian brain. It keeps our heart pumping, it keeps our lungs moving, and it helps us survive. The middle brain is the limbic system. This is where emotions come up. This is where we store memory. And an important part of the limbic system is the amygdala. The top and front of our brains is the neocortex. This is what we call the human part of the brain. This is where logic, impulse control, rationalization all occur. When we are functioning in our optimal window of tolerance, when we're not experiencing trauma either directly or indirectly or by memory, the frontal part of the brain, the top and frontal part of the brain, is driving the car, so to speak. The brain stem is in the back seat. But when we have trauma, when the amygdala sounds the alarm that we're in trouble, the brain stem takes over. It gets in the front seat behind the wheel, and the neocortex shuts down and goes into the back seat. It's important to know this because when we talk about trauma not being a choice, when we talk about trauma reactions being wired in our brains, this is the biology at work. When our brain stem is at the wheel, we typically fight, flee, or freeze. But when our neocortex is at the wheel, we have lots of options. We think through things. We make decisions based on our experiences and those around us. It's important to keep in mind that when we're having a traumatic event, when we've been triggered maybe by a memory of different trauma, that when the brain stem gets at that front wheel, we have to seek safety first. Talking with each other, supporting ourselves, those kinds of things happen in the neocortex. But if the neocortex isn't at the wheel of the car, those things aren't happening. So when we're having a traumatic response or we're supporting someone having a traumatic response, we've got to start with safety first. So we want to think a little bit about what makes us all at risk for trauma. And the number one thing that makes us at risk for trauma is having a brain. It is biology. None of us are superheroes, and all of us, by virtue of having a brain, are at risk for a traumatic reaction. Certainly experiencing a trauma, either primarily or secondarily, through our loved ones, through our communities, through previous memories. Those are also risk factors for trauma. Sometimes we think that if an individual's been through repeated trauma, they have a tough outer skin or they're in a better position to deal with future trauma. But research says the otherwise. The more often we are exposed to trauma, the more likely we are to have a traumatic reaction. Repeated exposure to trauma and stress is a risk factor for traumatic response, especially for secondary trauma. For those of us who work in stressful, chaotic, and sometimes life-threatening occupations, secondary stress is a risk. And for those of us who love people that work or live in those kinds of environments, we're also at risk for secondary trauma. Adverse childhood experiences. There's a wealth of research that talks about certain experiences that any of us can go through as a child prior to the age of 18. If you Google ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, you'll find out that 2/3 of all of us have at least one adverse childhood experience. There's a list of 9 experiences ranging from not living with a biological parent to having drugs in the home, a variety of things. But even having one of these experiences can increase the risk of a traumatic response later in life with unrelated events. Family history. There's also a wealth of research that talks about intergenerational trauma. For those of us who come from families where there has been trauma, chaos, and stress generation after generation, it increases the risk that we can have secondary trauma or even have a traumatic response to primary trauma. Finally, previous mental health or substance abuse problems make us at higher risk for a traumatic response, and vice versa. For people who have mental illness or who have substance abuse issues in their lives, much higher rates of previous trauma as a result of those experiences. Now, does this mean that if you have a brain and you're in a stressful and work environment and you had an ACE or you've got family history that for sure you'll have post-traumatic stress disorder? No, it doesn't mean that. In fact, post-traumatic stress disorder is one disorder related to trauma. The reality is many of us that are impacted by trauma don't meet that diagnostic criteria. So it's important to know what the risk factors are, but it's also important to know that a trauma reaction is not an illness in and of itself. It is a normal reaction to an abnormal set of circumstances. There's nothing wrong with you. It's about what happened to you. And if we as a community can use that in our own lives and with each other, we have a lot of potential to heal. So we know what the risk factors are for trauma. What are the protective factors? Why is it that some people have very similar chaotic or stressful childhoods or adult experiences to other people, and yet we have different outcomes? Often it's because we have different protective factors. A healthy brain and body go a long ways towards having a more healthy response to trauma. If I am somebody who's sleep deprived, if I am somebody who maybe has had a traumatic brain injury in the past, if I'm somebody who has chronic pain, those factors, those biological factors, can make it harder for me to deal with trauma. So a healthy brain and a healthy body are protective factors for a traumatic event. Manageable stress. The ideal isn't to have no stress, no matter what we think sometimes. It's important that we recognize that stress is just part of living. And as long as we can manage that stress, as long as we periodically have periods of lower stress, we're in a better position to deal with trauma. A sense of optimism and an optimistic perspective has been linked to improved outcomes for people who have traumatic exposure. Now, again, this doesn't mean that people can choose. This isn't a glass half full, you just got to look on the bright side kind of thing. But there is research that indicates that individuals who have a more optimistic view tend to respond better in traumatic situations. Conversely, individuals who've had repeated trauma struggle with that optimistic view. It's important to keep in mind on both sides of the coin. Protective factors for trauma include acknowledgement of traumatic events, ignoring or pretending that something didn't happen, deciding that my trauma can't be important because somebody else's trauma was so much worse. I didn't get hurt. I didn't lose a loved one. Those perspectives are appreciated, but they're not helpful in resolving trauma, especially secondary trauma. Recognizing potential traumatic events, looking at personal and community risk factors, being aware of our protective factors, these are all important in healing and moving forward. The opportunity to process thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Now, some of us do this more readily than others, but it is particularly important when we've been through a traumatic event to have somebody we can talk to. Sometimes it's a friend or a family member. Sometimes it's a pastor. It could be a school counselor. It could be a neighbor. Some people find chatting on the internet, going to websites committed to good mental health and trauma. Wherever you find it, having somebody to talk and process things through is important. Now, if you think, I'd like to be that for somebody, but I don't know what to say, that's okay too. Honestly, having the right thing to say is less important than listening and validating that people are heard. Occasionally clarifying things that maybe you don't quite understand is important, but having the right answer isn't necessary. Supportive relationships and a resilient community. Eastern Iowa, like all of Iowa and much of the nation, has not had a very easy year between the pandemic and then in Eastern Iowa last summer, the derecho, and now this event at the Anamosa Penitentiary. It kind of feels like when we just start to pick up, we get kicked back down again. It's important to acknowledge that. It's important to acknowledge that our community may not be quite as resilient as it would have been had we not had those other events. However, the good news, the fact that we do get up and keep moving, awareness that those are traumatic events, and practicing healthy coping skills within ourselves and with each other all adds up to more resilient communities. One of the best things that we can do is to pay attention to our body. We carry a lot of stress in the triangle from our neck to our shoulders. The tops of our shoulders right here carry a lot of tension and pressure. But we become acclimated or desensitized to that sometimes. So periodically and intentionally dropping your shoulders just a little bit, shaking things out, and then really trying to do that for several minutes. Stretching periodically, right? Those are important things to do as well. Again, listening to the body and giving it what it needs. Practicing breathing from your belly, right? A lot of us tend to breathe from our chest. But if we take one hand to put it on our chest and one hand to put it on our belly, where our diaphragm is, and breathe, you might find that your chest moves more than your belly. We want it to be the other way. Think about breathing from your diaphragm. This is a deeper breath. It's often referred to as a cleansing breath for women in labor and for people who are having physical pain. This works for emotional pain as well. Practicing breathing from your belly daily, even for just 5 minutes a day, has been shown to have lower rates of anxiety. If you can practice breathing or do some other kind of mindfulness activity at least 20 minutes a day, there's strong research that shows lower cases of anxiety, depression, and trauma responses in those populations. Speaking of mindfulness, there's a lot of conversation about mindfulness, but there's some misinformation out there too. Mindfulness isn't about clearing your mind, isn't it? It isn't about having nothing to think about. It's about managing your thoughts. A great way to practice mindfulness is to go to YouTube and find a guided meditation video. Now, some people think it's silly. They feel weird or they feel awkward. That's okay. Start small. Don't start with one that's 45 minutes or even 20 minutes. Start with a guided meditation video that's about 5 minutes long. Close your eyes, drop your shoulders, and follow along. Chances are in the guided meditation, you'll be asked to focus on your feet, or the cool desk under your hands, or your breathing. It might be hard to kind of bat away thoughts of making dinner, dealing with work, reactions to a traumatic event. But that's why it's important to start small. 5 minutes, 3 days a week. Eventually 5 minutes a day. Once you get to a place where you can manage your thoughts, you can focus on whatever the guided meditation is telling you, then bump up to 10 minutes. And then you do 10 minutes until you get there, gradually making your way up to about 20 minutes a day if possible. If you can't do it every day, every other day, twice a week, it's important to start wherever you're at and to do what you can make work. Getting wrapped up in all or nothing is the antithesis of mindfulness. Just do what you can. There's a fair amount of research around the benefits of a long vacation versus a daily break. Oftentimes, we hoard paid time so that we can get away for a week, and we do a lot of work trying to get out the door to make that week happen. Certainly vacations or time off, extended time off with friends and family, those are great things, and they make memories that last a lifetime. But there's a good research that indicates daily breaks, daily mindfulness actually has better outcomes than saving things up for that long vacation. Again, we're not saying that a long vacation is a bad thing. You need that too. But 5 minutes a day, 20 minutes 3 times a week actually has better emotional and physical outcomes than the long vacation. Something that's important to do is to check in with ourselves every day. There is a saying called PIES. It's a mnemonic, P-I-E-S. And it's a way to do a quick self-assessment just to know where you're at that day. I like to think of it as taking my pulse, knowing what I'm coming into the day with. So P stands for physical. What's my physical state right now? I'm kind of tired today. I'm taping this on a Monday. It was a long weekend. I've got a child who's not feeling so good. And so physically, I'm not as spot on as I'd like to be. Intellectually, I feel pretty good. I love having conversations like this and talking about ways that people and communities can feel better. I've had a lot of training in this area, and when I have the opportunity to share it with people, I feel kind of smart. So intellectually, it's a good time for me. Emotionally, I'm okay. It's been a stressful year. My husband has a friend who's really sick right now, and I'm kind of worried about him, especially as it impacts my husband. But overall, I'm doing all right. Things have been worse in the past, and I have hope and confidence that we'll move forward. And then spiritual, the S in PIES. Spirituality is a very personal topic, and a person's higher power, if they engage in that, is theirs to define for themselves. Regardless of your spiritual beliefs, whether they be formal and include temple or church, whether they be informal, whether they be more to do with your connectivity to the world, believing in something outside of yourself, even if it's nature, even if it is just the winds that blow, it's important. There's a good amount of research that indicates that individuals with physical health problems who have some kind of spiritual belief, and the healthcare providers that treat them who have some kind of connection to some higher power of their choosing, have better outcomes. PIES. Less than 5 minutes, I know where I'm starting the day. It's also a great way to connect with other people, friends, family, speaking the same trauma or stress language, if you will. Giving each other an opportunity to check in out loud, even if I don't know exactly how to respond, relieves stress and pressure, and it creates connectivity, something that's important when we're dealing with trauma. So, when do you know if you need something more? When do you need to consider additional help? Impact on functioning is a good place to look. There are a variety of quizzes and checklists that you can use. There are diagnostic criteria to see if you meet the clinical criteria for example, post-traumatic stress disorder or anxiety disorders. But the reality is, trauma impacts people whether you meet the criteria for a mental health problem or not. How is your sleep? Are you struggling to sleep? Do you fall asleep and not stay asleep? Has your appetite changed? Where is your self-care? If you usually shower every day and you're struggling to do that, that's a sign. That's something to listen to. Is the house more messy than usual? Again, usual. Not necessarily your neighbor or your mother-in-law, but you, where you're usually accustomed to functioning. Your energy and your focus. Are you able to set goals each day and get through them? And finally, the quality of relationships. Do you feel connected to other people? Has it become easy to just not talk? Has it become hard to connect to others in the way that you usually would? When multiple life areas have been impacted, either from intensity or frequency, that might be a sign that it's time to consider additional help. Understanding our window of tolerance, or what my grandma used to call her last nerve, is an important part of self-care and knowing when to get additional help. We all have a window. It's a place where, generally, we feel pretty in control and we're able to manage emotions. Life isn't perfect. Sometimes things happen, but in that window, we get things done and we feel pretty good about the way we're functioning. Outside the window, there are pockets called dysregulation. And dysregulation can run towards anxiety, where we are a little more irritable, we have a little more trouble sleeping, where we find that we've lost our focus and we have trouble multitasking. The dysregulation at the bottom of the window is more towards hypoarousal, where we have trouble getting out of bed, we have less energy, and we just feel kind of apathetic. In those pockets of dysregulation, we're still in control, but we're not functioning as well as we usually do. Sometimes we're aware of this, and sometimes it takes a coworker, a friend, or a family to say, what's going on? Because you're not just you. Hypoarousal and hyperarousal and hypoarousal are the other ends of the continuum. In hyperarousal, we're often angry, irritable, short. We don't feel in control. And oftentimes, our thoughts and our words, they just come out without thinking. This is a place where oftentimes people have trouble falling asleep, they have trouble staying asleep, and they have trouble in their relationships. They often look angry or anxious. They have a very short tolerance for anxiety and a strong startle reflex. At the other end of the spectrum is hypoarousal. People don't have as much feeling. They might not feel sad, but they also don't feel happy. Oftentimes, there's low energy, work absenteeism, struggle to finish tasks, and eventually, just being numb. It's important to recognize that the window of tolerance, the pockets of dysregulation, and those extreme ends of the continuum exist in all of us. Again, it's not about what's wrong, it's about what happened. And when we've been exposed to trauma, either primary or secondary, paying attention to our window of tolerance and listening when other people indicate that we become dysregulated is important. The further dysregulated we are, the more important it is to consider getting additional help. Again, frequency and intensity of difficulties are what we want to pay attention to. So, what does additional help look like? Our community has a wealth of resources. Sometimes we find additional help in pastors or at work in EAP programs, but oftentimes when we are in those pockets of dysregulation or at the extremes, it's a good idea to get help from a specialist. The Iowa Warm Line is a listening line that individuals can call. The people who answer the phone are people who are in recovery from mental illness and substance abuse, often impacted by trauma. They take their recovery and their lived experience, plus state-mandated training, and they listen to anyone who calls. It's open to all Iowans, including you in Jones County, and all Eastern Iowans, any time of the day or night. It is a chance to talk to somebody who's been there, and if you want, you can remain anonymous. Foundation 2 is a local organization that runs a hotline. They have text, chat, and mobile crisis outreach. People, professionals who deal with crisis on a daily basis, who can go to people's homes and workplaces if needed. This is also available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And where the Iowa Warm Line is just that, a warm line, Foundation 2 can be a hotline for people who have more pressing crisis. You don't have to have that more pressing crisis to call Foundation 2, but they are available if you do. The Warm Line and the hotline can be a good resource for us and our neighbors. So it's important to take note of the numbers on the screen, save them in your cell phone, and when you're having those critical conversations, remember when I said you don't have to have the perfect thing to say? Part of the reason you don't is because you can put the phone out on speakerphone, and you and your loved one and the operator on the other end of the line can talk together and come up with short and long-term solutions. Finally, it's important to know that in Eastern Iowa, the Abbe Center for Community Mental Health, a UnityPoint affiliate is available to you. We have offices in Jones County as well as Lynn County. We have counselors, doctors, and specialized programs for people of all ages. There is sliding fee scale in some offices, and they take most insurances. Again, this is a number that should be in your phone, available to you. There are counselors on 24 hours a day. It's important to know that you're not alone. What happened at the Anamosa Penitentiary, what's happened through the derecho, what happened through COVID, these are traumatic events, and we've had one after another. It's not about what's wrong with you. It's about what happened to you. And it's about how we as individuals, families, and communities can acknowledge the hurt and move forward to heal. My name is Theresa Graham-Mineart, and thank you for joining me today.